Hello everyone, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at transitioning from piston-powered airplanes to turboprop-powered airplanes. A big concentration today is really going to be on what's different and kind of what's the same and sort of what to look out for. So the way I've chosen to do this, of course, is I'm going to be grabbing kind of a piston plane, sort of walking you through, then jumping over to the turboprop plane and kind of showing you how things are a little different. So climbing in, the big thing with a propeller plane, or actually, well, they're both propeller planes, a piston-powered airplane is the presence of a lovely little reciprocating engine, which is chilling in the front. Now, a couple things with those engines. First of all, they're generally going to be air-cooled engines. The older engines are definitely going to be carbureted engines. Another thing, of course, you're going to have is there's going to be a warm-up period, and there's going to be certain instrumentation related to them that is going to be relevant for the operation of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to quickly get this guy started. It's a Mooney. It's not challenging to get started. Again, I'm not doing any specific procedure here or anything along those lines. Basically, let's just crank the thing. Keep in mind, in the real Mooney, you'd have to sit here and actually design it so that you'd have to basically prime it and all that. We don't have to worry about that at all for this purpose. But notice, I basically fire up the fuel. I crack the throttle just a little bit. I set the starter, and I just kind of crank it on over. That's basically all there is going to be to it. And, of course, this one's a little tricky to start. Now, a couple things you're going to notice. So we'll go ahead and pop that off right there. Everything's good. Engines are warmed up. You're going to notice a bunch of different things. First of all, because we are a typically leaded fuel, we're going to be dealing with the problem of building up all sorts of nastiness on our spark plugs. So when we're sitting here at idle, I have to sit here and manage the idle very carefully by changing the throttle. Now, if it's a really, really cold day outside, this is going to be kind of a pain in the butt. It's going to be very high RPM. If it's a very, very warm day outside, of course, it's going to be the opposite problem. And it's going to be basically, you have to be pushing the throttle halfway forward to get anything serious out of it. Now, the engine instrumentation on these types of aircraft is a little bit different. You'll notice, for example, we have RPM, which you'll see on the turboprops. We have MAP, which is manifold pressure. This is basically how much of a vacuum we're making. The bigger this number, the more power we're producing. We have a CHT, which we do not possess on a turboprop. This is our cylinder head temperature. This is basically how hot is the engine itself. It's the whole frame of the engine, the metal, if you want to think about it. And you can see right now that we're waiting for this to actually warm up to the point we can actually safely take this aircraft off. Because right now, it's not warm enough. Well, we'd have to give it some time. Now, again, if it's in the middle of the winter, that time can be substantial. The other thing we have, too, and we'll actually see something like this on a turboprop, is we have ourselves my exhaust gas temperature. This is completely a function of how much combustion I am and how clean the combustion is. Right now, it's 500 degrees. I definitely wouldn't want to rub against that if I can help it. The next one, of course, we have oil pressure, which you're going to have over on the turboprop, and we also going to have oil temperature, which is also going to be over on the turboprop itself. The other thing we can notice here, too, is that when we come down to our engine control handles, you're going to notice we have a throttle. We don't have a throttle on a turboprop, but we have a power lever. There's a slight difference, and we'll take a look at it when we get over there. We have a prop handle, which is present almost many turboprops, but it has a slightly different function, and we'll take a look at that in the turboprop. And, of course, you also have your mixture handle, which we have something like it. We have something called a condition handle on a turboprop, which is not the same thing. We don't actually control the air-fuel mixture on a turboprop. That would be involved, to say the least, kind of a thing like that. So as you can see, all these different components are pretty much all set, all pretty much ready to go. So let's go ahead over to the runway and get airborne, and we'll take a look at the next couple differences. All right, we're on the way. So now we're going to start to see the other differences, and when we go see the turboprop in a moment, you'll see these very clearly. The first thing we want to observe is if I take a look at my engine right now, you'll notice the fact that as I climb, one of the things we have to do right away is usually we're going to have to reduce the engine RPM for the purposes of a climb. So the Mooney that I fly is a little different. We have to go down to basically 2,600. This one's because of it's a bigger engine. It's one of the named Moonies, as they'd say. We can do 2,400 in our climb here. The other thing we can do, too, is our map. Generally, if we're doing any sort of climb, we don't want to be using that full power that we have there. We'd actually reduce it. But for the purposes of demonstration, I'm actually going to leave full power in throttle-wise as opposed to doing it. Now, as we climb, of course, you can see some of our instrumentation has changed. You can see RPM is holding constant, and we can see our manifold pressure start to slowly decrease. This is because, of course, the atmosphere is getting progressively less dense as we climb. It doesn't matter how far I push my throttle forward. It's not going to improve what I'm going to have as far as my power available to me. The other thing I'm observing, too, is my cylinder head temperature there is chilling pretty much at the same level there. It's slowly reducing. Of course, there's two reasons for that. One reason, of course, is we're climbing, so that would mean the air is getting thinner. The other thing that's going on as well, which you have to be aware of, is the fact my engine isn't producing the same power. There's not as much combustion. our exhaust gas temperature, which is a little bit to the right there, as you can probably observe, you can start to see that start to slide downwards as the air-fuel mixture inside of the aircraft is no longer a perfect mix. As a matter of fact, if I want to sit here and actually kind of manually adjust it a little bit, I can actually pull the mixture handle out, and that's what I'm doing right now, and you can see the temperature actually start to increase as the combustion starts getting a little more even. Notice our oil pressure, oil temperature is pretty much the same. There's nothing too unusual about any of that. So I'm going to go ahead and push the nose over, and once we get to 3,000 feet here, that's going to be plenty for us, 3,000. Then we're going to take a look at another big difference between the turboprops and your piston airplanes that surprised a lot of people. And that's the fact that when you do get yourself set up, we have to set our aircraft up for a specific cruise power. This is going to be the same on a turboprop. Difference being is turboprops don't have the same reduction in power that we're used to over in these aircraft. Again, we don't want to damage anything here. So I'll drop it down to 24 and 25, which is actually a little, that's not bad. That's going to be very close to 75% power for a Mooney there. And of course, what I'd have to do now is I'd have to sit here and start playing with the mixture handle a little bit, which is what I'm doing right here. And you can see my exhaust gas temperatures are slowly creeping upwards as I'm fighting a Microsoft patented turbulence here. Folks, it's a clear day. It would not be this bumpy. Sorry. And you can see we're actually pretty hot now. We're almost 1,500 degrees, so we can actually enrich it a little bit. And notice this whole process is quite a process. Now, another really big difference, Flight Sim doesn't get this right, by the way, is that piston planes have incredibly quick response. And that's going to be an interesting problem when we move over to turboprops. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the throttle to 0. You can see how long it takes to slow down there. I'm going to jam it all the way forward. Notice there's very little resistance there. Notice my exhaust gas temperature lags. That's actually very accurate. But it's very responsive. I can literally manipulate it, and you can see my power come. Please don't do this, turbo engine. You're being mean if you do that. But you can see just how much precise control I have over it. Of course, you can see the reaction of the engine there with the RPM. Please don't do that on a constant speed. That's like the most rude thing you can possibly do to it. And when we move over to turboprops in a moment, you're going to notice that those things are not going to behave the same way. Now, some people are like, well, do we still have to deal with P factor and all that other good stuff and torque? Yes, and that's going to be another issue for us. The final thing I want you to observe before we transition here is the fact that if we come down here, you can see I'm pushing about 175. This is a very fast airplane. And of course, you're sitting there going, 175 is not quick. For a single engine piston plane, that's moving pretty darn fast. And it's one of those things that you want to keep that in the back of your head, because once we start doing some other stuff, you're going to see how that's not nearly as fast as it looks. So as you can see, everything's pretty good. We're moving fast. Our throttle is very responsive. A lot of little doodads and things we have to play with in order to get it reliable. Let's go ahead over to the turboprop now. Turboprops. Big difference. This is the Cessna 208. When you're first getting started with turboprops, this is probably the safest bet because it handles the closest to conventionally piston-powered airplanes. So let's climb inside. A couple big differences you're going to notice, other than the scale. This thing is much bigger than the Mooney. I mean, I can not stand up, but I can like hustle in here. You can't do that in a Mooney. Those are tiny planes. But what you're going to notice is a bunch of things that are just different than what we've encountered in the other aircraft. One thing you're going to notice is our throttle quadrant down here has got 4 handles. And this particular aircraft has a separate handle that doesn't actually work here, so don't worry about that too much. And you'll also probably notice, of course, we have the possession. We lost a little left, right, and things like that. And we have different buttons over here on the side. And when we get everything booted up in a second, you're going to see we have different indicators as well. So let's go ahead and get this thing started. It's relatively straightforward to do. These are going to be all of our lights. We'll flip on some bacon stuff. Swinging over to the side here, we're going to go ahead and notice we have a standby alternate power should we need it. We have our avionics switches down here. Everything that we can normally need. We'll flip that one on. Quickly reset the alternator, make sure that's all set. We're going to switch this to the normal position. So now normally when we're firing up one of the piston-powered aircraft, you probably notice that we start with the fuel turned on. The first immediate difference here is going to be the fact that in this aircraft, we can't do that. We have a turboprop, and what that means is there's a gas turbine in here. That gas turbine spins at about 36,000 revolutions per minute. And of course, it goes through a gearbox to go ahead and reduce this down to a normal level as far as the RPM of the propeller is concerned. That's an interesting problem because we have to get that thing going really fast before we introduce fuel. Otherwise, the fuel sits in the bottom of our little gas turbine. And as soon as we spark, you end up catching the whole front of the plane on fire. That's basically what they call a hot start, if you want to think about it. Swinging down here, you're going to notice we have some different instrumentation now as well. Now notice oil pressure and oil temperature have stayed here. We have the exact same thing as we had in the piston. But notice now our instruments are different. We have something that says foot-pounds, which actually is completely backwards. It's always force than distance, but whatever. We have insta-stage turbine temperature, which is interesting. And then, of course, we have NG. Now, the way many turboprops work is the gas turbine that provides the power is not mechanically coupled to the actual gearbox and the propeller itself. The reason they do that, of course, is for like transients and, of course, just inertia. So one of the reasons that's like that, of course, too, is it creates new problems. That means that we have one instrument for what the gas turbine is doing, and then we have a separate instrument that's going to tell us how fast our propeller is turning. Now, this foot-pound, which that should be pound-foot, that's killing me. What this actually says here is this tells me how much torque, it's actually reaction force of the propeller at this given time. So it tells me how hard this whole instrument up guy is basically twisting itself through the air. Now, when we come down here and look at our handles, you'll notice there's something that's a little different. One thing you're going to observe is the fact that we have, this is not mixture, this is condition. Condition is basically our idle speed. You'll notice we have a low idle. A lot of times you have ground idle down here sometimes too. We have low idle, we have high idle. Coming to the middle, we have the prop handle, which is exactly the same, except we've got a little feather point back here if it was a real emergency. Not going to worry about that too much. And of course, we have a power. This is not a throttle. That's not labeled correctly. This is a power handle. And one of the things you'll notice, which is a little weird about it, is it has this little region down here that says beta. I've done a video on this one a little while ago, but for those of you who forgot it, is if we're in low idle and we have our throttle in here, we can actually adjust the angle of the blade directly, allowing us to either go backwards, kind of go a little bit forwards, or kind of go really quick on the ground before we actually get to the let's giddy up, let's go kind of a thing like that. So it's actually kind of neat how that works. This handle, by the way, that does not work on this one right here. It's a little different. Now you're saying, why is this not a throttle? Because it's not connected to a throttle. What you're basically doing is by hand moving this around, you're telling the engine control unit how much power you'd like available to you. Speaking of that, we have a new problem on turboprops as well, and that's the fact that because we climb at higher altitudes, the gas turbine in here actually produces more horsepower than we can handle without damaging the engine. And the reason for that, of course, is as we start to get progressively higher in the air, we need something that provides us with a little more power. So that's going to create a new little set of problems for us later on, but we'll do that. So let's get this thing started. Now we're going to leave with the engine off. We're not going to crack the throttle in any way. That would be very bad for us. Fuel pump is on. Now notice our difference here. We're going to come over to our starting switch. We're just going to snap that to the on position. And what you're going to observe here is that our gas generator's RPM, which is going to be this indicator here, is going to initially start to spool up. Or we're basically running this off the battery. And you'll notice our propeller is rotating very, very slowly. Once our gas generator gets up to a good speed, we can just come over to the condition handle, turn on the fuel. Now, when we engage the fuel like that, what you're basically going to do is you're going to allow fuel to start flowing up to the engine up front. And once it starts doing that, the rest of the aircraft will follow very shortly. Let's go ahead and give it a little boost to the fuel pump here, make sure everything's working smoothly. And you can see that it's starting to catch up. There it goes. So now what you're going to notice here is we have one indication here that's going to be telling us our ITT. This is going to be the interstage turbine temperature. This is an indicator of the temperature between the gas turbine and where that little power recovery gearbox is that's going to actually turn everything. What you're also going to observe is the fact that because of the way that this is all working here, is that when we're sitting here at certain temperatures, this is going to be one of our biggest limiters of this aircraft. And as you'll notice when I give it a full rev in a few moments here, you'll see just how big of an impact that actually has on us once we start rolling here. So you can see my big old propeller in the front is rotating. We do have a propeller RPM gauge here, and we know that our gas turbine here is now spinning at 60%, which is such a big difference here. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and quickly pop us up to high idle here. Right now we're in low idle. So flip that up, and what you're going to observe is my propeller RPM is going to shoot up, my gas generator is going to increase, and of course the temperature is going to come with it, as well as the amount of torque. Now my power lever here is completely at 0, but you're observing just how much torque we're producing right away. Now the cool thing is when we set power now, we set it based on torque and we set it based on RPM as limited by ITT. Now watch one of the other big differences with this aircraft. Now if I shove this like this, I just gave it full throttle. Look at how long it takes to produce the power that I need it to do. Now notice what happens. Did you notice that we over-torqued the engine and the temperature was spiking very rapidly? As I was saying before, many of these engines are actually flat rated. So because of that, our engine, we can actually, like I said, produce more power than we need at takeoff. People in piston planes are used to just jam on it and let's go kind of a thing like that. So we're going to go ahead and take off here. I'm going to go get ourselves all positioned. A big difference, too, that you'll see with a lot of planes. Top. Is often you have to take off with flaps. People who are used to like Cessna 172s and things like that, flaps is usually not your priority for takeoff unless you're taking off at something very, very short. For aircraft like this, we tend to have a bigger weight class. These tend not to be small planes. There are exceptions, like our TBM is a relatively small plane. Now, this one is not a relatively small plane. This one's actually pretty big here. So because of that, we basically almost always going to be using some form of flaps for takeoff. A lot of people will miss that. Now, the interesting thing is, remember how I flipped up to high idle a few minutes ago? Again, I had a video on that ages ago. One of the cool things now is I have to use the throttle directly to basically control what we're doing on the ground. So let's go ahead and get ourselves lined up, and we'll show you the big thing that always surprises people when they start moving up to turboprops. Now, this kind of problem, of course, is also going to be existing once you get yourselves up into jets, but that is for another video. Let's go ahead and give it a couple taps, get ourselves lined up. And I like that right there. Cool. So when we actually take off, we have to set takeoff power ourselves. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to apply a little bit of power, and I'm just going to let it spool up. Now, I'm at half of my power lever right now. Now, you'll notice the propeller RPM is already at the correct RPM. You'll also notice that little blue line that just appeared that's telling us that is the set point. And you can see how the set point is starting to catch up to where it actually is. And that would be right about there. Yep, there's a set point again, 2100. And I release it, and we start rolling. Notice how long that took for that power change to actually take effect. It's not to say that we don't have a lot of power, which, as you can probably observe, we're moving. And again, it takes very little to get this thing airborne. And look at that. Look at that. Bam. Just like that. Again, the Mooney wishes it could accelerate like that. And we are now airborne. I'm going to go ahead and pop up a click of flaps here. Remember, we're a much heavier plane. Pop up another click of flaps. And again, I'm going to hold my lovely 7.5 magical degrees here. For one thing you'd be doing, of course, that would be different with a plane that's just physically heavier, is you'd be doing a lot of trim adjustments here. That's what I'm basically scrambling to do. Now, notice I climb. Now, a lot of people, of course, if we were going back to our piston example earlier, I would immediately reduce my RPM. You can do that, but you don't have to do that. Again, some manufacturers are going to be different. The reason being is my RPM is independent of my torque. And people are like, what? It's because the gas turbine produces power. The RPM is just basically whatever angle I want to set the propeller blades. There are some efficiency pieces in there that make this a little more challenging. But for the most part, once I've set it, I can forget it. So swinging down here to my engine instruments, there's a couple different things I want you to observe. The first thing we're probably noticing right in here is the fact that, other than my torque is not the world's most consistent, that's okay. Notice my torque is going to be slowly decreasing. Again, kind of tough to see here, but it will slowly reduce with time. The other thing I want you to observe is the fact that my interstage turbine temperature, remember how our cylinder head temperature was going down, will actually start slowly hiking upwards. The final thing we're going to see, of course, is my gas generator, of course, is going to shift as well. Now, depending on who modeled what, different people have modeled this correctly, incorrectly, depending on how they actually model the aircraft, this can get all funky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and push my throttle forward. Notice, by the way, my governors are racing to catch that. And I'm going to shove my throttle. I don't want to go into the red too far. There we go, right there. Whoa, too much, one too much, one too much. Oh, that's good enough right there. So a couple things to observe. First of all, we're at peak torque right now. We're still producing exactly the same amount of torque we produced at low altitude. But what I had to do to fix that is I had to actually push my power level farther forward in order to be able to keep that up. So as we climb, I have to continually shove that handle more and more forward in order to maintain the same level of power. Now, a few moments ago, I was mentioning my RPM. You even have to set it. The big thing with RPM is it's always going to come down to, I hate to say it, noise and vibration. If we're climbing, we have passengers, we don't necessarily need to climb at that RPM. But watch what happens when I reduce my RPM. Again, we're going to come down to 1800. Look what happens to the torque. Remember, we're measuring reactive torque here. You see how it's starting to flash red at me? The reason it's doing that is because my reactive torque is increased because I've increased the load. Now, the other thing to observe, too, is as I pull this handle back, we're down to 1800, it gets a little bit quieter in here, but I did nothing to my actual climb performance as it was just a few moments ago. Now, if you remember back in the Mooney, too, one of the things we had to do was fits with all our handles for our mixture. We don't have to do that here. I can completely leave that alone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get us a little bit higher, and then we'll show you what starts to happen as you start getting even higher with an aircraft like this. There we are. So now there's a couple different things that have happened. One thing you probably have observed is I did not touch my power lever, by the way, is you'll observe that my red line is actually shifted. And the other thing you'll see is my gas generators come down. So I'm going to go ahead and push my throttle further some more. And what's going to start to happen is you're going to immediately get yelled at for your torque here, which doesn't surprise me. I'll back it up a little bit. Notice by adjusting the throttle, the red line changes. But the other thing you probably observed is how far up our interstage turbine temperature has hiked. because if you believe it or not, my engine's actually working harder than it did at lower altitude. It's actually spinning faster. It's creating heat, and I'm actually losing a little bit of economy because of that, as it's desperately trying to basically keep the same amount of torque we had at low altitude against that flat rating concept. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and level off. That's not an awkward altitude to level off at. And then we're going to take a look at transition into, whoa, see it? See it? We're going to take a look at our transition into our actual cruise phase. I'm actually going to pull the throttle back just a tiny bit here. Again, the people who did the G3000 here, G1000, did a really, really nice job simulating this aspect of that very quickly, which was nice, but unfortunately, as my speed changes, this number will change as well. Part of the fun, as I'd like to say. So we're now ready for cruise, and you're sitting there going, okay, so what do I have to do special for cruising with turboprops? The short version is nothing. The reason why is because we can basically, in many turboprops, not all of them, mind you, we have the ability to basically cruise at the same torque that we actually took off with. The only thing limiting us, of course, is the ITT, which is going to get progressively hotter as we get higher because, again, more power. Our NG, which is going to be how fast the gas turbine is turning. And then, of course, we have our torque limitation as well. And you can see right now we're quite happy. And again, you're saying, what about that RPM? Didn't you reduce that? Yeah. Could I theoretically reduce that RPM even further? Yeah, you definitely could. And again, if you're trying to reduce noise, and it's all going to be based on the aircraft itself. Some of these aircraft do have some pretty strict limitations as far as you can only operate at this RPM setting, at this torque. It depends on the version. As a matter of fact, you can actually look right here. It even gives you a little warning about that, so you're aware of that. Now, notice here, I've pushed this power lever all the way forward. My propeller's back a little tiny bit, and I'm producing oodles and oodles of torque here. You can see I'm within my temperature limits and within my gas out thing. And our speed here is 181 knots, which is very quick. Now, if this aircraft were retractable, which it is not, we wouldn't just be doing 181. We would be doing 225. And that's my kind of final point about the turboprops. And that's the fact that they're significantly faster than a lot of the piston-powered airplanes out there. Obviously, a P-51 is a quick piston-powered plane. But your typical Cirrus is never going to light a candle to your typical TBM, for example. And that's going to be one of those things that you're going to have to be prepared for if you've been flying them a lot. Now, I'll go ahead and end this one here just by demonstrating how slow the throttle responds. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my power level all the way to 0. Watch it go. Full power. No power. That is the biggest change for people who are transitioning between the two different types of power systems, is how slow everything responds. And in the real aircraft, it's not that it's a massive delay. It's a substantial delay. It's different, which means if I'm sitting here trying to very, very carefully adjust my approach speed as I'm coming into land, for example, I have to be ready for that. I have to be pretty much on everything before I start fitzing around with it. Otherwise, I'm going to have issues. Now, if you want to see something cool here, I'm going to go ahead and increase my RPM back to 1900 here and watch what happens to my torque. Interesting. Like I said, it's very, very, very fascinating how these things all work differently. So hopefully this video shows you some of the differences. One difference I won't demonstrate is the fact we have a reverser, and some aircraft do and some aircraft do not. But other than that, be watching out for those little tiny differences between the two. Next time, of course, we'll take a look at going from a turboprop to a jet. Enjoy.